I'm going to try and do something which is hard for all of us, which is to come with what we call criticism in the positive sense, to try and understand. I think that this is often with gedolim not done sufficiently because we're frightened. I don't need to tell anybody in this room, but just in case there were to be somebody, for over 10 years of my life, I was very, he was standing right before me, and not only for 10 years, and there was an incredible sense of terror. And there was also an incredible sense of love, which I don't think that he actually understood the extent to which so many of us had towards him, because we couldn't get past the terror to express the love. And I'm not sure he would be able to get past whatever he needed to get past to receive the love. And because of that, it's also hard to criticize because you got to get past the simple sense of criticism. So I'm going to try and do that. And I think that although usually in academic conferences I talk without pieces of paper, in this case I'm going to actually read, because that enables me the certain distance that Rav Soloveitchik once, when he was talking, Rav Lichtenstein once when he was talking about Rav Soloveitchik, he said to us that he could only open up when he spoke in front of thousands of people. So that's the first point I want to make. The second, I could say a lot of stories now, and I'm going to just say one particular thing which really holds the issue in focus. When I was not quite young in Yeshivat, after the first few years, I went to Manhattan, and at the time you couldn't buy books in Israel of all types. And I went to Barnes & Noble and, of course, bought a bad translation of Aristotle Metaphysics and a good translation of his Ethics. And I bought Paradise Lost. I came back to the yeshiva and mentioned to other Talmidim at the table, Israeli Talmidim, of course, who were older than me and more knowledgeable and also incredibly open-minded, that I had bought Paradise Lost. And because, obviously, and somebody walked off the table, I don't remember now who that was, incredible zilzul, looking back over his shoulder as if I totally didn't understand the game, and said, just because your Rebbe likes a book, that's a reason to read it. And I think that really catches what so fundamentally was going wrong as far as understanding Rav Lichtenstein, because when I started studying literature, only then I understood his drashot, and when I studied about the personality of John Milton, I really felt I suddenly had an explanation of the person who had been standing before me all along. It could be partly because I was studying from Professor Sandy Budig in Hebrew University, who also was a student of Douglas Bush. And it could be there was something similar there. So okay, so I'm just mentioning that. There's a fundamental problem in methodology in what I'm doing. My academic area is philosophy and literature and not sociology. And there's going to be something overly sociological here, and I don't have the methodological training in that arena. But I think there's going to be enough which is sufficiently obvious to people that hopefully it'll answer for that. I feel that people don't enough talk about Rav Lichtenstein's hard for me. I'm used to saying Moriv Rabbi, and it's kind of weird. So I'll just say Moriv Rabbi once in the beginning and then let myself go. About Rav Lichtenstein's weaknesses, natural weaknesses, and the challenges he must have faced. And although I didn't discuss them, they were pretty obvious. They're going to come up in what I speak. I was very unclear whether to mention them. I was very happy that Rav Chaim Navon mentioned it this morning. We don't talk enough about his fundamental speech impediment, which is really very important to understand the sacrifice he was making, and sometimes also the sacrifice that we were making. Okay, so I'm going to, I'll just say a few words of introduction and then jump straight in. Rabbi Dr. Aaron Lichtenstein, first time I've ever said that, rarely discussed his academic and literary interests in yeshiva settings. However, one exception was a common reference to the last line of Milton's poem on his blindness. They also serve who only stand and wait. In this presentation, I discuss how a wider understanding of the biographical details, religious context, and moral dilemmas that Milton faced, and even his own self-perception, are enlightening in making sense of fundamentals in Rabbi Lichtenstein's life and thought. These relate both to the development of elements of his religious philosophy and also to the personal and communal choices that he made. Okay, I'll jump. Okay, so very clearly, issues under scrutiny. Okay, what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to mention a few issues about Rav Lichtenstein's life that we all know about, and then I'm going to talk exclusively about Milton. And that usually in academic conference, I would assume that everybody would know about Milton and very few people would know about Rav Lichtenstein. Here it's the other way around, and because it's the other way around, I'm going to talk just about Milton. And those who may have heard of Rav Lichtenstein might notice why I'm saying what I'm saying. But I'm not going to talk about Rav Lichtenstein for the next 10 minutes, except for the next few lines. The issues concerning Rabbi Lichtenstein that this talk will focus on are the following. 1, his demanding upbringing and wide education, his belief in the value of scholarship per se, and his comparatively self-sufficient or insular approach to it. His bringing together two different traditions of scholarship, totally believing in both, while giving total precedence to one. His use of the wider tradition not only as a practical tool, but even to understand the nature of religious morals and experience. His sacrifice of an assumed career path in order to respond to an historical challenge. His finding himself theologically and politically alone after aligning himself with an ideologically activist camp due to his rational approach to religion. His tendency to scholarly polemics, again, something that no one likes to talk enough about, with social and moral ramifications, his combination of a humanist ideology and puritanical personality, ethics, moralism, hard work, and self-sacrifice. Okay, so those are the elements of Rav Lichtenstein I want to talk about. And for the next 10 minutes, I'm not going to say his name, or next 8 minutes. Okay, for those who know Paradise Lost very well, the next piece will be unnecessary. Okay. Like other scholars of his age, John Milton absorbed the breadth and depth of both the classical and Christian education. However, he synthesized them in a particular way that was both fundamentally different to and also went beyond what others aspired to. Now I'll talk a bit about angels. In his Paradise Lost, Milton dressed up biblical pagan gods as fallen angels. Thus, the pagan claim of there being other forces in the world is given a monotheistic context and basis. These gods are given ontologically real existences, although not as deities, but as fallen angels. In so doing, they are presented as more than meaningless human inventions. The nature of these angels and the narrative itself is very obviously based upon the Greek gods as they appear in Greek myths, but their names are the names of biblical idols. Thus, while not suggesting that the Greek gods themselves are real, Milton gives the idea of Greek gods a real existence by writing about them as fallen angels. Notice the synthesis, it's very important. By giving the fallen angels biblical names, Milton steers clear from establishing any truth content to Greek pagan theology, and instead asserts the truth of the biblical tradition even regarding the nature of pagan gods. However, not only is the entire narrative based upon Greek mythology concerning their gods, but the angels act in manners reminiscent of Greek gods. They are like immortal humans. They fight like humans, only that being immortal, they can only hurt but not die. Thus, Milton indirectly asserts the general truth of part of the basis of Greek mythology, i.e., that there are immortal human-like forces in the world, only that he marries this idea to monotheistic theology and narrative. Okay, so just to explain for those who are not that much into Paradise Lost, what I'm pointing out here is that Milton is actually totally connecting the world of Greek mythology, giving it some kind of truth value through a Prshanut of monotheism, okay? By giving Greek idols, the names of idolatrous concepts in Tanakh, and by talking about fallen angels. Milton was not writing in ancient Greece, but 17th century England. Since he was not speaking the language of the time, this was not a didactic device to convey meaning to the reader in the most accessible manner. Rather, Milton clearly viewed elements of Greek mythology to be based on universal truths, or at least perceptive insight. For that reason, he translated its terminology and converted its concepts into forms that are legitimate and meaningful in monotheistic terms. So that's the first point to point out. In other words, Milton really believed something was going on in Greek myth. And he didn't believe in idols. And he really believed something was going on there. The muse. This is mostly from the beginning of Paradise Lost. Milton engaged the muse in a manner reminiscent of the ancients and married the muse to Judeo-Christian conceptions of prophecy, a bit similar to the Rambam. This was not merely a literary device, but rather Milton's authentic perception of his own inspiration. Since Milton was invested in the writing of a theodicy, he explicitly formulated his aim as to being to justify the ways of God to man. This means that he interpreted and expressed his own personal experience and creative religious expression through the forms and terms of the culture of Greek mythology. He's understanding his own religious experience through the experience of pagans, okay? Crucially, Milton viewed and expressed his very inspiration in the forms of a tradition that was foreign to the theological system that he used those forms to elucidate. Clearly, he felt that there was a fundamental and universal truth to various ideas of Greek culture, such as the idea of the muse, which he could use to understand his own religious, artistic, and intellectual experience. And he felt that the best development of those ideas was outside the tradition of his own spiritual anchoring. Okay, that's very important. The best expression of his own spiritual experience was outside his spiritual tradition. Okay, now let's talk about intrinsic value. Okay, Milton did not aim to merely merge two disparate traditions. Rather, his poetry is clearly in the service of the one, which is Christianity, using the other, the classical, as enrichment. Nevertheless, the tradition that was in service was not merely a device, but rather was itself a major ingredient of the enrichment. Milton believed in its intrinsic value, even though he did not believe in the veracity of its theological tenets. Okay, he didn't believe in the classical theology, but he believed in its intrinsic value. As opposed to those who disbelieve the values of the foreign culture and use it only as a tool of influence, what we call nowadays charedi kiruv, such as a rhetorical device, Milton truly believed in the values of classical literature to engage the depths of human experience and expression. He was truly a son of both traditions, even though he was a believer in the one. Okay, I don't know who I'm talking about now. He was a sage and prophet of the one, who not only wielded the wand, but also wore the cloak of the other. He saw himself as a Christian theologian, now I know who I'm talking about, who used the wealth of classical literature to enrich himself and others, to see deeper and express better. Milton's synthesis shows a true belief in the value of the humanities per se, and specifically concerning their use in the service of religion. He saw himself fundamentally as a religious person who could see and express deeper because of his broader scholarship and artistic endeavor. Okay, so that's the first half of the comparison. Now let's talk a bit about their life. Sorry. Milton trained from a young age to become a scholar poet. The wealth of even esoteric knowledge from different traditions that he mastered exhibited his belief in scholarship per se, and not only as a tool to activity in the world. Yet, when the English Civil War or Revolution broke out, he committed his entire mental and physical powers to its service. He became a political scholar, a polemist, primarily drawing upon his classical training in philosophy and theology rather than his poetic ability. This is a great sacrifice. This was a religious calling. He was rising to the dictates of his conscience in answering the call of history. In so doing, he jeopardized his career. It bears pointing out that his polemical writing, now I know some people might find it hard with the suggestions that might be in this sentence. You can just keep it to Milton if it's hard for you to compare. It bears pointing out that his polemical writing is many notches below his poetry in quality. His prose is burdensome, expressing more conviction than art, and his theological statements are not in themselves greatly significant, in the case of Milton. They are important mainly as windows into the thinking of the great poet yet to write his magnum opus. Milton consequently lost his sight, and his own mind, probably not true, but in his own mind, his loss was presumably an outcome of his work of self-sacrifice, the hard work of laborious scholarship under stress, and furthermore, laboring in an area that was presumably not his forte. Paradoxically, as blindness may have been the reason, I'll jump that piece, it's not so necessary. Thus, Milton's line that Rabbi Lichtenstein would often quote, "They also serve only stand in wait," is not only about his blindness, but also about sacrificing a career path for one's perceived obligation upon hearing the call of history. Theological and political outsider. Milton was politically aligned with the Puritan cause, but his theological writing differs from theirs on crucial points. His theology is dogmatic and attuned to the dictates of scholastic philosophical rationalism concerning issues such as predestination and free will. Milton was angered by other religious leaders who doubled back and crowned the son of the king they had deposed and beheaded. There's a lot of his writings about that. He leveled against them the accusation that they desired a return to Egypt. Thus, Milton was politically aligned with a religious group from which he differed theologically. This made him more rational in approach, and in practice eventually left him in a political minority with a comparatively diminished influence. Humanist, puritanical, and polemical. This is the last paragraph on Milton. Milton was a humanist with puritanical tendencies and a strong sense of the importance of doctrine. That might sound similar. He also had a strong sense of his own social and historical responsibility. Hence, he was deeply involved in polemics and assertions of the truth. This is particularly interesting given the fact that his own theological position, due to its rationalism, would have been considered heretical to some. Milton's polemic was political, yet it's based on scripture and theology, besides scholasticism. Right? So first he wrote against censorship, and then he famously became a censor. And this is something that obviously there's a lot of ways to rationalize, but what I would argue is this is a typical tension which is always telling. It is a tension that is natural and inescapable for any humanistic, puritanically spent scholar with a strong sense of historical mission and doctrinal responsibility. Such a scholar invariably believes in pluralism of thought and the free development of ideas, but simultaneously feels an immense obligation to clarify and uphold the truth according to his or her own lights. Okay, so what I'm pointing out is that it's important to understand that the situation of Milton and of Lichtenstein as liberal, open-minded thinkers who find themselves all the time in polemical arguments, sometimes in places of censorship, is a fundamentally necessary tension. Okay, comparisons to Rav Lichtenstein. I have 5 minutes. Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein lived a very different life to John. Milton had different abilities. He was neither a poet nor a political agitator, but a Talmudic scholar. What? Slow down. And university-level educator. However, most of what I've mentioned above concerning Milton can be said, albeit with obvious reworking of content and context, about Rav Lichtenstein. Okay? Rabbi Lichtenstein was given a demanding education from a young age, and the self-sacrifice of his work ethic remained always featured as a major mainstay and hallmark of his personality and of his preaching. He developed through a thorough proficiency on the highest levels in both rabbinic Talmudics and Western Renaissance literature. His self-perception was totally rabbinical, and similarly, his career path ostensibly excluded daily engagement with the Western canon, as most of us know. Yet, when he did draw upon these other arenas of wider humanist studies, it was in a manner that exhibited a belief in their value per se, both for understanding people and for one's own spiritual and moral enrichment. There was a clear conceptual synthesis which betrayed no theoretical tension, but rather exhibited a mutually fruitful relationship. Now, this might be hard for some people to hear. Rabbi Lichtenstein jeopardized his career by leaving the side of his master, Rabbi Soloveitchik, in the United States, moving to Israel after the Six-Day War. The move was answering a call of history with a desire to be influential in the molding of religious society in the land where he saw the future of Judaism to be playing out. In so doing, he found himself in a sociological and political minority within the religious Zionist camp in Israel. And notice the similarity. This was both because of his rationalist elements of his theology and a tendency towards classical religious dogma. Due to this idiosyncrasy, Rabbi Lichtenstein occasionally branched into polemical expositions and engagements. I argue this was not an aberration, but a direct and perhaps necessary outcome of his puritanical and dogmatic nature, and its marriage to rational theology and humanist thought. Okay, we don't talk about this enough. Rabbi Lichtenstein's daily occupation was primarily giving very, very long classes to students in Talmudics. The classes were a fitting context to applying his brilliance to educational purposes. They could be riveting, wide knowledge, complex and rich thinking. He trained personally hundreds or thousands of Talmudists. However, it bears noticing the sacrifices involved in this approach and questions that arise concerning it. Rabbi Lichtenstein suffered from a bad speech impediment throughout his life. I spent hours going through his tapes, trying to understand the word that wasn't said. His enunciation was poor, his tone monotonous, and speech slow. It could take new students months to fully comprehend him. He could have chosen to invest in a small number of elite students. I wouldn't have been in the group. and an educational approach with far less lecturing hours. Yet he chose a form of laborious teaching that was accessible to wide audiences. I think he had before himself an ideal acquired of his mentors of being a Talmudic teacher, and he clearly sacrificed both his own comfort and a lifestyle to achieve this. Okay, just the one last note on methodology, because it's not clear what I'm arguing at all. Okay, it is unprofitable to merely theorize about Rabbi Lichtenstein's private or subconscious thoughts concerning Milton. Okay, I do not profess to know whether the similarities noted here establish John Milton's influence upon Rabbi Lichtenstein, or rather explain why Rabbi Lichtenstein was originally drawn to John Milton as a young man. I would venture to posit both simultaneously, for people are typically drawn to great thinkers with whom they share some basic features and are often consequently deeply influenced by them. What I do believe I can positively argue is that these similarities between them have explanatory power. We can talk about what explanatory power is in philosophy. They help us understand Rabbi Lichtenstein's life decisions better by enriching our understanding of the type of personality that makes such decisions, and by suggesting a specific source of inspiration for those decisions. Okay, it also adds to all the things Rabbi Lichtenstein spoke about in the idea of why you study literature. To understand, you also study literature to get from the people you're studying. And the last thing I just end up by pointing out is that it opens up a question as to what a Rebbe or a mentor is. He spoke about having 3 Rebbes, and it's obvious to all of us that Reb Chaim Brisk and the Rambam were also Rebbes of Rav Lichtenstein through books, and we sometimes forget that, or put it this way, a rabbinical scholar is also an accomplished man of letters. Identifying those wider influences is crucial to understanding the man himself. Thank you.